All right, well, we're going to get started. We're in Acts chapter 27 together this afternoon. We've got 2 chapters of the book of Acts still to go here. We're getting pretty close. We do still have a few maps in the back of the room. If anybody doesn't have a map, you might like one today. For a while, I was using a map to bookmark this Bible, but somebody didn't like me doing that. Anyway, they're right by the hymnals over there. So we are, again, Acts chapter 27. I think we're going to probably move through a good chunk of this chapter quickly today. If somebody wants to start us out, what are we looking at? 27 verses 1 to 8.
And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan court named Julius. And embarking in a ship of, I'm going to have some help on that one,
Adramyttium,
thank you, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. We put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus. Boy, these are some good ones. A Macedonian from Thessalonica. Okay. What?
You read.
Yeah. The next day we put in at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, whatever. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lacia.
Sure nice to hit Fair Havens there, wasn't it? Yeah, those the C and the N don't go together in English. What's that word doing there? So thank you, Carl, for braving your way through.
I managed to do that somehow. If he wasn't so precise with all these names, he could just say, we got on a boat and we went to this city.
He could, but this is also useful for an encouraging reminder that, yeah, it's historical. This is actually real. These were real places, real people. These things really did happen. And there we go. Pull up my little chart of how many miles they're traveling here, so we're going to be keeping track of all that. So the trip from Caesarea, so if you're looking at your map here, Caesarea is labeled in the bottom right, right above Judea. We've got Caesarea on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. They're going to be traveling from Caesarea all the way over to, eventually, Rome in the very top left corner of our map. How did they do with the purple line on this one? Looks pretty good, actually. I don't know about that dip downward west of Fair Havens and then a dip upward and then leveling off. I'm not sure about that. Maybe that was the author showing us that they got blown all over the place. There's not quite the evidence of that. But anyway, ships, when they traveled in this point in history, often stayed close to land. They did not like going out towards the middle of the sea. It was riskier water. So if you're mapping out their journey as a crow flies, it's at least 1,000 miles to make this trip. But if you're hugging the seacoast, you're at least going to be at 1,500 miles for this journey. I don't know the best estimate for how many miles a day they could handle at sea. It varies by so many different things, including weather, which is not going to be good for this trip. Pretty much start to finish, they're going to be hit by hard weather. Carl already ran into some of that with what he read for us so far. Under good conditions, I think I've read before about 120 miles in a day, but these aren't good conditions, so that changes it pretty quick. We should sail for Italy, so we have Luke involved again. As he switches back to the first person plural, we. We've had no mention over the last few chapters, as we had his arrest and his time under guard and all those things for a couple of years. We didn't know who was with him. He never told us, so Luke never included it. The nearest reference we had was back in chapter 23 when Claudius Lysias was sending, so the tribune was sending Paul to Caesarea under guard so that the Jews couldn't carry out their plot to kill him. And he sent mounts, plural. We talked about why he might have included plural mounts for Paul. Could have included his nephew that had warned of the danger. It could have included maybe somebody like Luke or somebody else, but we didn't have a definitive there. So this is certainly some of the strongest, and at that point, we also have Acts chapter 20, where we had seen a group of 9 together, counting Luke and Paul, who had traveled at the end of the third missionary journey back to Jerusalem. Carl read one of them here in verse 2. Aristarchus is still with Paul at this point. I mean, I guess I can't say still. He's with Paul again at this point. Maybe he was with him the whole 2 years in between, but he's still with him at least now. Some of the others may have already traveled home, or maybe they traveled off in other directions. Maybe they're still in Jerusalem. Those questions aren't answered for us. Is Paul alone? Is he the only prisoner aboard this vessel? We're told nothing of the others, so we don't know what crimes they've committed. We don't know how dangerous they might be or might not be. We just don't have that information. But they are also on their way to Rome. Then he names a cohort for us. We've had a cohort name before. Anybody remember the name of it? It was the Italian cohort. Back in chapter 10, it's what Cornelius was part of. The cohort is the second largest military unit in the Roman Empire. 10 of these make up a legion. The cohort itself would have 10 centurions serving over it. One of these centurions of the Augustan cohort is a man named Julius. So you can see a couple of Caesar names, right? Augustan, Augustus, or Julius, even with this centurion's name, Julius Caesar. So some common names for the throne there. We don't actually know if the Augustan cohort's name comes from Caesar Augustus, but it sure makes sense that it would. The study Bible suggested that that particular legion that they were a part of was stationed in Syria, which would be just above Sidon, so not far away from this. Easy for that group to be summoned to assist on this journey. All right, then we got the first challenge in verse 2, ad remedium. Oh, sorry, Carl?
No, just a question on the first verse here.
Yeah.
Where Luke is saying that we decided to set sail for Italy. Was he part of the prisoner group at this point, or he just decided since Paul was going, they were going to go, or we don't really know, I guess?
Yes. Yeah, we
Yes, we know.
It's a good question. Is Luke ever imprisoned in this? I don't know that we know. The same's true for Aristarchus, although Paul in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, Paul will actually call Aristarchus his fellow prisoner, which is something he writes during his 2-year stay in Rome. So is Aristarchus a prisoner now? Is Luke a prisoner now? Luke doesn't bother to tell us. We only know of Paul for sure.
So in his trend, it said, we have decided.
Yeah.
And then here it says, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy.
Well, it says when it was decided that we should sail.
Yeah.
So
So
I'm
it's
not sure whose decision.
So it's not Luke's decision. It was decided by the governing authorities that were sending Paul off to Rome. Yeah.
So in Luke's account in Acts, do we pretty much think he was there with Paul in all of this chapter, or we don't know for sure if he was constantly an eyewitness and everything he was writing here?
For this chapter, yes, he's there for all of it. But for the context of the last few chapters, the 2-year prison stay, he he removed himself from that account. So we just don't know if Luke is still back in Jerusalem doing ministry there, or learning there from the apostles maybe. Some suggest he takes that time to do his research that allows him to write the gospel account of Luke. But it's possible he was just hanging out where Paul was the whole time, and he was learning from Paul. So, yeah, vacant detail there that we just can't figure out. All right, so we got that first tough name of Adramyttium at the start of verse 2. It's a port city in Mysia. So if you look at your map again, kind of in the middle, I don't know, is it even labeled? Neither of them are. Where Troas, that little city at the top center here, Troas is labeled. Troas is a port city in Mysia. So Adramyttium would be somewhere nearby to that. That's not that they caught a boat there, but the ship's from there. So this is where the crew is from. So when you think of them returning home, well, they're making the journey halfway across the sea. They're going to get at least part of the way. So the soldiers are willing to board this particular ship. So they're going to be, as that purple line indicates pretty well, they're going to go up past Cyprus, and then they're going to sail along the southern edge of Asia Minor, stopping at port cities as they need to along that path, unloading some cargo, buying other supplies or goods to trade elsewhere, picking up new passengers, getting rid of old ones, all those things that ships might do. So if you're looking, our map doesn't really label the different portions. That but right above Cyprus would be called Cilicia. And then as you move west, you would get to Pamphylia, Lycia, and then to Asia finally, which is the western chunk of Asia Minor. So that's the route that this boat is planning to take. And so as they sail, Luke mentions the extra traveler Aristarchus from Thessalonica and Macedonia. So he's also potentially seeking to head home. Doesn't get there. Ends up in prison with Paul in Rome instead, we learn later on, again in Colossians. If he's not in prison now, he's just a traveling companion to Paul, and this boat is, again, heading in a good direction to get him home. But he ends up stuck in Rome with Paul somehow, so maybe he already is a prisoner as well. Verse 3, they start by leaving Caesarea and traveling pretty much north there on the coast to Sidon. It's about 72 miles to go from port to port there on the edge of the sea. The journey has officially begun. As we were looking at before, there's no mention of an official letter from Festus to Caesar, although that was hinted at before. We never see it or hear of it. We don't know if Julius is aware of it or not. And if Julius is carrying the letter, is Julius allowed to read the letter, or is the letter sealed for the Caesar's eyes only? Those are questions, again, we don't know. But it seems at least probable that he was told who his prisoners were, given enough of a rundown of their situations that he could care for them or guard his own men against them in whatever ways were necessary for these particular prisoners. And whatever he learns of Paul, it's enough that he's willing to give him some freedom. So what exactly the leave to go to his friends refers to, it could refer to just the freedom aboard the ship. So if Luke and Aristarchus aren't actually imprisoned, that Paul's able to move about a little more freely and be cared for by Luke and Aristarchus, taking some of the labor off of Julius and his men to treat and care for Paul however they'd need to. Or it could refer to their time in Sidon specifically, that Paul was allowed to get off the boat and go visit with the group of Christians who lived in Sidon, and that they were able to care for him, encourage him, pray together before Paul got back on the boat. Just not enough there grammatically for us to tell between the two. Verse 4, Cyprus is nicely labeled on this map for us. It's that big island in the northeast part of the Mediterranean Sea. It would be about 140 miles to go from Sidon to the northeastern part of Cyprus. You can see it's kind of got that longer landmass sticking out of the northeast corner. They're going to have to sail around that, so it might have added a few extra miles than what I just mentioned. But they're going to use the island as a windbreak, so the wind won't affect them quite as much, won't slow their travel as much, or damage the boat. Was a goal, but that's not going to work on the full length of the trip. They're going to lose this ship. Sorry, correction. They don't lose this ship. They're going to change ships. They're going to lose the next ship. But not a good trip. So this would indicate, as they're trying to use it as a windbreak, that they're going to stay close to shore. So you can picture them maybe a little different than what the purple line draws for us, hugging that eastern seashore of Cyprus as they go up. And then as they turn around that top north corner, they're going to then draw closer to Asia Minor and they'll land up that way. I think it gets that part a little bit better, although maybe where the red line is. But you can't put the purple line where the red line is because then you can't see all the lines. So
The term lee, is that protection? Or is that...
yeah, it's where I'm getting the windbreak idea from. So it's close to land. Protection, yeah, that's the picture.
Okay.
So
As opposed to the windward side, the leeward side.
Leeward stands for leeward then,
Yeah.
okay, so, okay.
verse 5, they travel the northern edge of Cyprus. So there's about a 50-mile gap in between Cyprus and Asia Minor, that blue strip that we have there of sea. And again, Cilicia is going to be that region right there north of it. If you're trying to find Myra is actually labeled on this map. Most maps it's not. It's not as easy to read because it's in black and butts up against the blue color of the sea there at the end. But it is, Myra's right here. It's the first city along the purple line once you turn past Cyprus. Myra, port city, again along the bottom edge there. You're probably looking about 150 miles west of the western edge of Cyprus in terms of measurement. They weren't hugging Cyprus, so but 150 miles is about the distance to go there. This is John Chrysostom, 4th century, said, again trials, again contrary winds. See how the life of the saints is so composed of all these things. He escaped the court, and they fall into shipwreck and a storm. Kind of does those backwards. They fall into a storm, which causes the shipwreck. But anyway, you get the picture, right? He's showing that what we see in the book of Acts is certainly not a life of ease for the apostle. He goes from one danger to another, which he recounts in one of his own epistles, talking about all the things that he has endured in his travels. So verse 6, they now port at Alexandria. Sorry, not Alexandria. They port at Myra. And they find a boat from Alexandria. And so Paul, Luke, perhaps Aristarchus, along with the other prisoners, the cohort guarding them, the centurion Julius, all these are going to leave the Adramyttium ship. They're going to get on the Alexandrian ship. A simple procedure, right? The Adramyttium ship is headed home, and that's not where they're going. But this ship is. This ship is bound from Alexandria for Italy. That's where they want to be, so they're, connecting flight here. Language we would use. I don't know how many of you are used to traveling by ship, so flights are a little more common in our stuck in the middle of the nation geographical position that we're in.
They didn't have Expedia back then, so they had to go to each port and they figure out, okay, who's going where I'm going now.
Hotwire, Priceline, any of that, whatever there might be out there. Yeah, those sites are so common today, but yes, the thought here is that, and the Study Bible shares this, is that this ship is hauling grain from Alexandria down in Egypt to the heavily populated area of Rome. and so it would make some trade with Asia Minor as well on this path, but that this might have been a very common path for a ship to take, and so the centurion, knowing of such travels, probably already had it in mind he could catch a ship here. That's what the study Bible's suggesting for us. And Marshall agrees with that idea. I don't know if Myra was necessarily like the common port for them, or if they're hitting all of those ports. It would make sense to me that they'd hit any of them. So he had the expectation of finding that transport that he needs. Verse 7, the winds, again, been rough in this trip. They use Cyprus as a windbreak, and as they have cleared that, they find themselves being pummeled by wind again, preventing their travel, slowing them down. So our next location mentioned is, I'm going to pronounce it Cnidus. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but again, our language doesn't have that, those letters next to each other. It's nicely labeled. Our map's doing quite well today so far. That's good. On the southwest spot there of Asia Minor, it's about 150 miles west again from Myra. And then they struggled desperately as they hit the open sea west of that. They're going to be pummeled by the wind even more, and they're 120 miles away from Crete before they get another windbreaker to help out. So Crete, again, very clearly, easily labeled for us here in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea out there. We don't have Salmone mentioned on here, but Salmone was on the northeastern part. Actually, I think the purple line on this particular map probably covers up the northeastern corner of that island. It's hard to tell. But anyway, the northeasternmost point would be where you'd find the port of Salmone. So that's going to be another stop on this journey. And then verse 8, as far as Carl's read us so far, they get to Fairhaven. Fairhavens. Fairhavens is labeled well here, I would say. We can't see it quite as clearly. There's a spot, if you're going along that southern edge of, I guess I need to go this way, along that southern edge of Crete, it's going to turn north for about 8 miles, and then it's going to level off and go west again. Fairhavens is just a few miles east of that spot where it goes north. So you can't see that too well in this particular map, but I think it's going to be relevant when they try to leave Fairhavens before we get too much further in the text, because they end up back in open ocean and open sea and getting pummeled again, as they do. So to go from Salmone down to Fairhavens is another 150 miles again. So I don't know if you're keeping track, if anybody's doing that math. What are we at so far? 300, 450, 570, 700, 840, 912 miles. They've made it a decent trek so far on the trip. Second boat, second crew. And that it acknowledges here, Luke does, that there's a nearby city, Lasea, or I guess it could be Lasea, 2 miles to the east of Fairhavens. The sizes are going to be different. Lasea is going to be the larger, the better known of the two locations. As they want supplies for their journey, that's where they might be needing to go. The whole context is going to indicate for us that Fairhavens just isn't much of a port. Yes, they stopped here. They must not have really wanted to stop here, as we'll see, because they know wintering here is not a good idea, which is what we're about to read. But before we do, any questions on what we've got on their journey so far?
So it's taken them close to probably 2 weeks if they can only make 120 miles a day, or is that?
So under perfect sailing conditions, this might be 10 days or so, but they've been battling brutal wind the whole time. So I don't know if you picture walking or riding a bike into the wind and how much it slows you down. Yeah, I'd say we can easily double or triple how long it's been since they started their journey. So they could be at 3 to 4 weeks here instead of just 1 or 2. Luke does not tell us. He will keep track of time a little bit once the big storm starts. That'll be a 14-day event. All right, well, next is 9 to 12.
ship.
Jim's checking to see if it's safe.
Okay, since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to Paul, what Paul had said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on a chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the tough one in there, if we didn't have one of our own, would be Phoenix, but we have our own Phoenix, right? We know that word. All right, so verse 9, the captain of this Alexandrian ship decided to remain in Fair Havens for a while. That could be potentially weeks, maybe even months. And it's because of the danger. It's because they've been pounded as much as they have been. And so now they're stuck with the tough decision of what to do next. But before we get to that, Luke mentions that it's dangerous because even the fast was already over. That is a reference to the Day of Atonement, which is the 10th day of the 7th month in their calendar, which would for us be late September, early October. The Jews held the best time to travel the Mediterranean Sea would be between the Feast of Pentecost and the Feast of Tabernacles. So from May to September was the time that you want to sail the sea. The Romans had a bit more of a wider range than that. They would go from the Ides of March to the Ides of November, so roughly March 15th through November 14th. So we've just entered sailing season, right? We're March 26th today. So either way, neither the Jews nor the Romans thought it was safe or wise to sail during winter. As the weather would get rougher, the sea would get rougher. We are not told in verse 9 that anybody sought Paul's opinion. Maybe they did, but we're not told that. He offers it up anyway. So verse 10, his advice, he advises the centurion Julius and the crew that they need to stay put for winter, that if they try to go on any further, the ship and the cargo would be lost, as well as the lives of the people. I hesitate to call this an actual prophecy because the third part doesn't happen. God protects the lives of the people. Nobody on this voyage is lost. They lose the ship, they lose the cargo, all that's true. But this part is not. So this might just be Paul's own wisdom and experience from his own personal past. So 2 Corinthians 11:25, Paul tells us he's been shipwrecked 3 times. He wrote that before this. So I guess that makes for 4 shipwrecks for Paul. He's got a little experience on the sea. And he's got a little experience of the sea going very poorly. And so he's trying to use that wisdom to care for his neighbor, right? You're braving dangerous things that you ought not mess with. So verse 11, understandably, the centurion ignores Paul's advice. Right? He does not know Paul. He doesn't have that connection. He consulted the men in charge. He consulted the guy that owns the ship. He consulted the guy that's driving the ship, if you want to phrase it that way, the pilot or the captain. And they're willing to risk it. They think they can reach a better port city where they'll be safer and better protected, which again does not speak very well for Fair Havens, nor the economy in the city of Fair Havens. And then verse 12, we get the same kind of a note. It's not suitable to spend winter in Fair Havens. The harbor's referenced, suggesting that the harbor wasn't good to protect and preserve the ship. So the crew, they make the decision to move on. They're going to try and reach Phoenix, which is 40 miles along the southern edge of Crete. But again, you've got that spot where Crete's going to turn north, and they've got to hug that sea, and that might be where they get in trouble as we move into the next paragraph here. But before we do, questions on Crete. Carl?
Sounds like the authority here was by a vote of majority. The pilot just didn't say we're going to do it. They voted on this to move forward. So
Yeah,
decided to put forward.
It certainly could be. I mean, a recognition. We're all stuck in this together. We're all either wintering here and wasting months here, or we're risking our lives there. So, yeah, they do seem to go in on this together. There were several conversations about how the boat might actually be under Roman occupation, like that this could be a particular merchant vessel that works for the empire rather than just a free merchant that does what he wants to do, in which case the centurion would probably have more pull. But I don't know if that's something certain or not. But yeah, I mean, you can see they certainly got together and they talked this one through and decided this was in their best interest. They were wrong, but that was the decision that they reached. All right, that brings us to 13 to 20.
Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the nor'easter, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay ahead of us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned.
All right, thank you. So verse 13 again, the winds made this whole journey extremely difficult, but at the moment the wind calmed down, tempted them to move on. So they lifted anchor. They set sail, hoping to be able to reach 40 miles further west on Crete to get to Phoenix. Again, in good conditions, that could be done in a day with little trouble, but conditions end up not being good. They thought they were, but once they get going, they get hit hard. So the verse 14 has two words in it that are not used anywhere else in the Bible. I'm not sure if any other Bible verse can say that, unless it's one of the ones with the really random names, which we've had some of those already in this chapter. But tempestuous would be one, and then the northeaster is the other. So tempestuous in the Greek is, let's see if I can get this, tuphonikos. What word in English do you think we get from tuphonikos? Drop off the ending. Tufan. Typhoon. So my lexicon suggested whirlwind, typhoon, or hurricane as possible translations for this one-off word that we don't see anywhere else. ESV uses tempestuous. The word tempest got used later in the paragraph, but it's not the same root word even. They don't look alike in Greek. So that's tricky for us in English because of the translation. So it refers to a very violent storm. A tempest is a violent storm, so that fits. The northeaster is, in other Bible translations, sometimes just given the Greek name. So the Euraquilo is the name here, Euraquilo. But that would have just given Carl another one to wrestle with.
I didn't need that.
Yeah. So this is from Wikipedia. It says the Euroclydon is a cyclonic tempestuous northeast wind which blows in the Mediterranean, mostly in autumn and winter. It is the modern Gregalia or Levanter. So they don't use that name for it anymore, is that reference. But again, it was calm for a bit, and then they're hit by a harsh storm. And it's going to come down off of the island of Crete, hitting them from the north. Verse 15, they're no match for it, despite being professional sailors. We're used to seeing this in the New Testament, right? The professional fishermen that they were on the Sea of Galilee, and yet they got hit by storms a couple of different times that just came out of nowhere, and they lost all hope. Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? Oh, ye of little faith. So they surrender their efforts to keep control of the ship, and they ride the wind until things will settle down. Verse 16, the island of Cauda is not visible on this map. I guess it kind of is. So if you look just underneath the island of Crete, you see that little white dot right above the purple line? That's it. That's the island of Cauda. Today, I don't know. So today there's an island with the name, and what I don't know is how to pronounce it. It's either Gandos or Gavdos. And I say that because in Greek, their letter that looks like our letter V, it makes the N sound, not the V sound. So it has a V, but I don't know if I should pronounce it in our way or in their way, right as I read the name. Anyway, it is the southernmost island of the modern-day country of Greece. So part of Crete's governance structure today. To travel from Fair Havens to Cauda would be about 40 miles west, which is about the same distance they were hoping to go, just not the location that they wanted to get to. They got pushed further south. Once they get to Cauda, again, this little island provides them a little wind relief, enough that they're able to regain a little control. They work on the ship's boat. And English sticks that word ship in there to help us out a little bit, because the word ship is not in there in the Greek. It's just the boat, right? But it's specifically, the Greek word is not your regular word for a boat, but the little lifeboat, as we would think of a lifeboat. Skiff, if any of you like.
Dinghy.
Yeah, dinghy. So any of those kinds of words. In the ancient world, rather than having them on board of a big ship or having them hanging from the side, they would drag them behind. So they'd be attached to the rear by some rope, and they would just sail behind the big boat. So you can imagine then, in a big storm with everything getting tossed to and fro, you have multiple risks. You could have that little guy capsize and you just lose him, or he becomes an anchor dragging you down. Or he can be being tossed by the wind and the waves up against the hull of the ship, possibly damaging the hull and putting a hole in you, which would not be good. So they bring it in, they pull it in, and they secure it on deck. Notice here Luke says, we managed with difficulty to secure. Some of the commentaries suggested this is just Luke using the plural like he did before. We gave way and were driven along in verse 15. But I'm looking at it a little more like all hands on deck at this point, right? It doesn't matter if you're a prisoner or passenger, whoever you are, help, right? Everybody's needed. Let's salvage what we can. So anyway, they secure that. And then you get verse 17. So they hoisted that up, and then they undergird the ship. So this is back to the other word for a boat, the more normal word for a boat, including the one used of like when the disciples are on the Sea of Galilee. And so it seems to be that somehow they are trying to brace or support the hull of their big ship. Marshall listed 4 different possibilities here. He said it has been understood, first, of ropes that were tied vertically around the side of the ship to hold the planks more firmly together. Second, of ropes tied longitudinally around the outside of the hull from stem to stern to strengthen it. Third, of ropes tied across the boat inside the hold to strengthen it. Or fourth, of ropes tied longitudinally over the ship from stem to stern and then tautened in order to prevent the ship from breaking its back. So he declares we can't possibly know which of these it is at this point, but those are the options of things that they might have been doing. Whatever it is, they're trying to use whatever means they can to strengthen the integrity of the hull of the ship so that this storm does not sink it to the bottom of the sea, which would not be good for anybody. But then Luke mentions a particular fear that they have of running aground on the Syrtis. That is a reference to the sand banks of Libya, which is down in northern Africa. And it's actually what was labeled for me on the map when I was doing the research. It doesn't quite make our map. So this here is eastern Libya, and this bump here is western Libya. And then if you were to just kind of make a little loop down here where it cuts inland a little bit, that would be where the Syrtis are. So it's kind of like one of the commentaries made a parallel to the Bermuda Triangle, like our thoughts of that today and how people fear the Bermuda Triangle idea, that's kind of how these sailors would have viewed this, that you just get pulled in and your ships get destroyed and it's not good. And they're hundreds of miles away from there, but the sailors are terrified of that possibility, and so they're already going to try to make some kind of change to prevent it. And so the literal translation of the last few words of this verse would be, letting down the vessel, thus they were carried. So maybe they let an anchor out on the north side of the boat. As you think of, the boat tipping this way is then going to turn a little bit more this way instead of the wind pushing them to the south where they don't want to go. Let's put weight on this side and try and go more westward, which is where we want to go anyway. That's a possibility. I also saw, this was from Balgi, he said to prevent this, the crew lowered a sea anchor. And this was a large piece of canvas which was fastened into a funnel and lowered into the water behind the ship. There it acted as a drag, slowing the vessel's headlong flight before the wind. So he more suggests that it's just an attempt to slow them down rather than necessarily steer their course. I'm not a sailor, but I'm learning some sailing terms today. So. All right, we went through 20, so 18. Again, things are only getting worse. They get to the point where they're jettisoning cargo. Why do you get rid of cargo?
Lighten the ship,
Wait.
taking out,
Lighten the ship. Why are you lightening the ship?
taking out water.
So it can float better.
So it floats better, right? So they're in trouble, right? Because if you take on too much water, you sink. So that renders this voyage a complete failure. When you think of the Alexandrian crew and what their mission is of getting goods and bringing them from one destination to the other, they just tossed over their year's work, right? But at this point, they just want to get home. So it's understandable. They're trying to live. But any profit hope is gone. And then the next verse, that wasn't enough. So what do they throw over next?
Yeah, so tackle working tools.
Yeah, working tools is a good way to phrase it. Any of the gear, any of the equipment which they could have used for keeping up the ship, or other potential profitable side endeavors of work they could have done, including something like fishing, right? They're throwing anything and everything overboard. A couple of the commentaries got stuck on the idea that they threw it overboard with their own hands. They were just stuck on why Luke would even bother saying with their own hands. It seems obvious, which is fair. It does seem obvious. But maybe I didn't see them suggest this. If I'm suggesting something, it's that they didn't lose their equipment because of the storm, right? So like the storm's tossing them around. Oh, look, we needed that. No, they threw it over of their own accord because, again, they're trying not to sink. Verse 20. Luke then shares with us the storm, and again, that word tempest is here. Storm is actually the Greek word, when I looked it up, could mean storm or winter, which is interesting. They had a word that could mean those two things. It lasted for days on end. He doesn't tell us the precise number, although we will see 14 a few verses later down. Again, extreme danger, extra danger to them. The wind can blow on the sea in any direction, the Mediterranean Sea. It's not like here where we're used to the wind coming from the west, right? Storms come from the west. Storms come from that way. They go that way. But on the mostly they can catch us by surprise on occasion. But on the Mediterranean, they went all over the place. Like I tried to look that up last week. I was looking at a map of winds on the Mediterranean Sea, and they were just going every which direction. There was no consistency to them at all, from what I could see. So, if the storm has blocked out the sky, the sun and the stars for the last many days, you are literally lost. Like, at least if you can see again, you can see where the sun is. You have a little bit of bearing, right? The sun rose over that way, so that must be east. But you can't see that much, right? Or the stars, they could chart the stars and use the maps of the stars to figure out their position underneath them, like a lot of ancient world traveling did, but they've got nothing. They are literally lost without an idea, without a map. And so finally, as Luke tells us, battered as they are, they've given up hope. They've come to the point where they think this is going to be the death of them. They're going to be lost to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. All right, well, thankfully, we don't get to end on that note. 21 to 26.
Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong, and whom I worship, and he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart then, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.'"
Thank you. What's going on with the food?
We threw everything over and there's none left.
Yeah.
That's not improbable. It's not the case, but it's not improbable.
Get wet and rotted.
No, they're going to eat some of the food later in the passage.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so rough they couldn't get to it or fix it.
Good guesses. You're trying. It's a tough one. It's a bit of a conundrum. Why aren't they eating? Most of the commentary suggests it's because of stress. Have you ever been so anxious you lose your appetite? That's kind of the direction that they take it. Until verse 33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day. You've continued to be in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food. It will give you strength." The suggestion that is made by Marshall at that verse is that they're fasting in prayer to their gods. Save us, right? The connection of prayer and fasting has long been one not just for Christians but for other religions as well. So I didn't see any commentary. Even Marshall didn't seem to say that here at verse 21, but he said it at 33. So I thought it was interesting and worth bringing it up now. It certainly could be possible. And it would make a whole lot more sense for why Luke phrases 21 this way, right? Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up and spoke. If they've run out of food, it doesn't make sense that he'd stand up and speak. If they're rationing their food, it doesn't make sense that he'd stand up and speak. But if they're abstaining from food to pray, then what he has to say makes sense. So actually, I like that idea quite a bit here as being what's going on. Before I got to verse 33 and saw that part of his commentary, my notes I had written down that they were thinking it was a short trip. They were going to go from Fair Havens. They were going to go 40 miles west to Phoenix. That was only going to take a day or two, right? They didn't need a whole bunch of food, so they exhausted most of their supply or were rationing the end of their supply, and that's kind of where I was at. But again, we learned better in 33. And then actually in verse 38, when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing the wheat into the sea. So they had extra food still, and they threw it overboard, right? So the fasting idea or the anxiety idea seem to be the two that have the most weight to them. And I like the fasting one as I reflect on the text as a whole. And I even heard Joyce say it. The way Luke phrases this somehow prompts Paul to speak, and he begins with an "I told you so." Now, why does he begin with an "I told you so"? He's calling their attention to the idea that you didn't listen to me before, but listen to me now, right? I was right before, I'm right now. Listen. That's the picture of why he's saying it, right? So he reminds them, he had warned them before, this voyage wasn't a good idea, should have remained in Crete, should have stayed in Fair Havens. It's interesting that he uses Crete here, because Fair Havens is where they were. They were trying to stay on Crete, but they got blown away from it. If they had listened, they would not have lost their cargo, their tools, they would not have suffered the hunger that they've been going through. He's not rubbing it in. He's calling for them to listen again, to listen now. He calls them to have courage in this desperate moment. You might lose the ship, you will lose the ship, but you're not going to have a single man die. How many men are on this boat? Good looking ahead. 276. Right? We'll talk about that number when we get there, but they're all going to live. What's Paul's source for this good news? An angel. That very night. So sounds like in a dream, but he doesn't use that language, so can't say it for sure. But an angel visits him. Now the angel could be Jesus, right? Because angel means messenger. So God could send the message through an angel, or the Lord could have brought the message himself. Paul doesn't specify. I'd lean towards just an angel, but it's a divine message either way. We were reminded that in the previous chapter, 26:17, Jesus had promised Paul he was rescuing him from the Gentiles and the Jews in order that Paul could then proclaim Christ to the Gentile and the Jew. We saw that in chapter 23, verse 11, chapter 18, verse 9, chapter 22, verses 17 and 18. This is not a rescue from men, but it's a rescue from the violence of a storm. So there's a reminder for us that God is the one who controls weather. He's using the storm. He's using these events. In part, righteous judgment, but also an opportunity for the sailors and the soldiers to learn of him from Paul's words and also from his mighty work of saving them. In a polytheistic culture, it is not far-fetched to see the sailors agreeing to what Paul says here. We would maybe think that way today, like if we had a bunch of Christians and a bunch of Muslims on a ship together in this situation, like one group would not be so quick to say, okay, we'll pray to your God instead. But again, polytheism, they had the general belief, oh yeah, there's lots of gods out there. So yeah, maybe this guy's God, maybe he's got a point. Maybe his God will save us. Our gods aren't doing it, so maybe his will. Right? You can see how they could come to that kind of a conclusion. His God's offering to save us, thanks be to God. So they're willing to listen. Paul uses a couple of words to stress his close relationship with the Lord. The first is that he belongs to the Lord. To whom I belong. It's a very strong picture of our life as Christians. It's one that a lot of people don't like, but it's very strong nonetheless. We are God's possession. He says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. 6 times in the Old Testament he called his people his treasured possession. What is your most treasured possession? Good answer. I like that answer. It's not what I was going for, but think in the worldly sense. What is the most valuable, treasured thing you own? What would you do for that thing? What would you do to protect it or keep it and not let it be destroyed or stolen? Like, what lengths would you go to? That's the picture here that Paul is essentially giving these sailors, right? He is God's treasured possession. He belongs to the Lord, and the Lord will protect him because of this. It's an interesting picture, and again, it comes from the idea that we belong to God. So, at what you mentioned, Jesus, good. We're his treasured possession. The scriptures say that. So what length did he go to save us, to preserve us, to protect us, as we think of the cross and his empty tomb? So Paul's language, calling them to think differently. They were without hope, but here's a man who says that his God sees him as precious and worth saving, and he's going to save him. Then he also identifies this as the God that he worships. That worship word could also be translated serve. This is easily understandable for the hearers, whereas the belonging word might not have been. I don't know that like a follower of Zeus would have said, I belong to Zeus. But they would have said, I worship Zeus or I serve Zeus. So that language is readily understandable for them. And then we get verse, how far did we go? 26. Okay, we get verse 24. We get the words of the angel. So do not be afraid. Common refrain from angelic messages, right? And then he declares that Paul's going to stand before Caesar. slightly more specific than what Jesus said in chapter 23, verse 11, where he said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Now it's not just in Rome, but it's before Caesar. So the angel's message here is more direct. We don't know if Paul, on this trip to Rome, gets to stand before Caesar or not. Now, this does not invalidate the angel's words, because we know he gets there. It just might be later. And so God, preserving his life this time, allows him to be there later, right? It's possible he makes Caesar this time, but we don't have any evidence for it in Scripture to know for sure. Our evidence he makes it there the second time is Caesar kills him. So Caesar ordered his execution, so we know he got before him. But the Caesar in both cases is Nero. Nero's heavy persecution of Christians hasn't begun yet at the point of this text. It won't begin yet for another few years. It doesn't mean he wasn't necessarily persecuting them at all, but at least the heavy side of things hadn't happened. So it almost appears that he gets to Rome. He's on the docket, like he's on the schedule. How many of you have been on a doctor's schedule and you just keep getting bumped back, and every time you get bumped back it's 3 months or 6 months, and then, before you know it, it's been a couple of years. So that's a grand possibility for Paul here, is that he's on the docket to see Caesar and just keeps getting slid back. Court system's backed up. He never gets before Caesar. A couple of years go by, and eventually the Roman court system just says, whatever, get out of here. Which they appear to have done with Pilate, but that's a whole other story. So we don't know, but eventually he will stand before Caesar, and it does not. If it's the first time, if he's there before Caesar the first time, it doesn't seem to have any impact. Maybe Caesar holds him for a while, like Festus held him for a while, or I guess Felix held him for a while. Or maybe it took 2 years for him to get to Caesar, and then he finally got to Caesar, and Caesar said, "Yeah, they were right. You didn't need to be here. Get away." We don't know. The third piece, though, is that God is going to save the whole crew. As we pointed out already, 276 people. God spares all of them. He's got a mission for Paul to complete. The mission's not done yet, so he's going to spare Paul, but he's going to save all those that are with him too. Specifically, the angel's phrase is, "God has granted you all those who sail with you." That makes it sound like this has been Paul's prayer. Lord, save these people. Save us, preserve us. And that the Lord is answering that prayer. I'm granting you what you've asked for, is kind of the language here. So take heart, men. Right, he bookends his little speech with courage. It's the same word in Greek. God's going to save us. So he declares he has faith in God. He trusts God to do what God has said that he'll do. The rest of the men, thus, are invited to trust in the Lord the same way. And against all odds, as they see this salvation come about in the coming weeks, to remember this, to remember these words, to remember the promise of salvation, when they all thought they were going to die. And then we get verse 26, "We must run aground on some island." This, to me, sounds more like Paul's words than part of the vision. I mean, I suppose the angel could have shown him in the vision crashing onto an island somewhere, but Paul sounds pretty vague in general here, and just says what almost seems obvious. If we want out of this, we got to get to land, right? We'll crash somewhere. So forget a port, forget saving the ship. We're going to lose the ship. He's already said that much. Let's get aground, and we'll be okay. You got to skip ahead a while to find where that is. Chapter 28, verse 1, they realize the island where they crash on is Malta, which is on our map all the way over yonder.
Yeah, no kidding.
South of Sicily, south of Italy. That's over 500-mile journey from where they had left before. So we'll get to that one next week. This is it for us today, though. We've hit our time for class, so unless there's any questions before we take a break, we'll finish chapter 27 probably next time, because we've got 44 verses. We've got about 18 of them to go or so. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.